Have you ever felt like you were stuck in an endless cycle, seeking answers, hoping something would change, but nothing seemed to happen? Sometimes, life feels difficult, full of uncertainties and obstacles, and even when we try to do things the right way, we find ourselves in moments of discouragement. But what if you knew that by applying certain spiritual principles, you could activate God's blessings in your life in a powerful and transformative way? We're not talking about magic formulas, but spiritual secrets passed down through time that, when followed with faith, can bring light even in the darkest moments. These secrets are not reserved only for the most spiritual or those who have achieved great accomplishments. They are for anyone who desires to see God's hand moving in their life, bringing peace, direction, and most importantly, an unwavering confidence that, no matter how out of control things may seem, He always has the best for you. By applying these principles, not only will you witness a transformation in your life, but you will experience true freedom, a freedom that comes from fully trusting in God and His perfect plans. Humility is the virtue that teaches us to remember that everything we have, everything we are, comes from God. Imagine yourself as a traveler who trusts the guide to cross unknown terrain. Without it, it's easy to get lost. In this way, considering our dependence on God is like holding tightly to His hands as He leads us through the ups and downs of life. When we are humble, we don't place ourselves above others, but we learn to value each person as someone important in the divine plan. This brings us peace because we accept that control is in the right hands. This humility also opens doors where pride creates walls. When someone approaches with a humble heart, it's like opening a window to a genuine relationship. Think of everyday situations. Have you noticed how much easier it is to help or be helped when the words carry humility? Recognizing our limitations and asking for help, whether in a task or a difficult moment, doesn't make us smaller, but reveals us as human beings. And God, who resists the proud, pours grace on those who choose simplicity. Moreover, being humble transforms the way we see our accomplishments. Imagine a person who cares for plants, knowing that, despite watering them, growth comes from something greater. Similarly, humility makes us trust that the fruits we reap come from divine victory. This perspective fills us with gratitude and makes us more approachable, ready to learn and grow. Humility is not weakness, it's strength that comes from trusting in something greater than ourselves. Generosity is more than simply giving, it's offering from the heart, expecting nothing in return. Think of how many times a small gesture changed someone's day, a smile, a word of encouragement, or even sharing your time with someone in need. It doesn't matter how big the action is, but the love with which it's done. And when we are generous, something incredible happens, our lives are transformed. It's like planting a seed that, as it grows, doesn't just bear fruit but multiplies victories around us. When we practice generosity, we strengthen the relationships that matter. Imagine a friend who is always ready to listen, or a neighbor who shares what they have at the right time. These acts create bonds that withstand time. And this doesn't only apply to material resources. Giving your time, your affection, or even your attention to someone in need can be more important than any physical gift. Generosity is a reflection of God's heart in our lives, reminding us that He multiplies everything we give with joy. Furthermore, generosity brings us closer to the divine purpose. Think of Jesus, who gave everything to save us. He is the greatest example of selflessness. Following this path teaches us that giving does not impoverish us, but enriches us. Generosity, in essence, is a channel of victories flowing directly from God to the world. Patience is learning to trust in God's perfect timing, even when everything seems still or out of place. It's like looking at an empty field, knowing that a harvest is on the way. In moments of hope, patience teaches us to have a peaceful heart, confident that God is working behind the scenes. Imagine that project that hasn't succeeded yet or that dream that seems distant. Patience reminds us that what comes from God always arrives at the right time and is far better than any rushed plan we could make. Being patient also helps us deal better with others. Think of a relationship that has gone through challenges. Instead of reacting with pressure or impulsiveness, waiting for the right moment to act can save friendships, marriages, or even family connections. It's like water that, over time, wears down even the hardest rock. When we are patient, we show trust in God, accepting that not everything needs to happen our way or at our pace. This attitude brings us peace and allows victories to come at the perfect time. Moreover, patience strengthens our faith. While we wait, we learn to depend more on God and less on ourselves. When you are praying for something that hasn't happened yet, instead of giving up or complaining, stand firm. Use that time to grow spiritually, study the Word, and help others who are also waiting for their victories. Patience is not inactivity, it's trusting in God while preparing for what He has in store. And when the answer comes, you'll see that every second of waiting was worth it. Forgiveness is a key to liberation. When someone hurts us, the pain can be deep, but the decision to forgive is an act of faith and trust. It's necessary to understand that forgiveness is not about forgetting the wrong, but about releasing the burden it causes us. Forgiveness makes room for peace in the heart, allowing God to act in our lives. When we forgive, we come closer to divine grace and are able to live lighter and fuller lives. By releasing the other, we free ourselves from the weight of bitterness. Forgiveness doesn't mean we must accept the wrong or trust again immediately, but that we accept that God's justice is perfect. This can be hard to understand, but it's a powerful spiritual principle. Jesus teaches us that forgiveness is a reflection of the divine love that dwells in our hearts. And when we do this, even without seeing the immediate result, God honors our act and grants us freedom. We cannot expect healing to come without allowing the grace of forgiveness to flow. A practical example of forgiveness in action is when you remember a past hurt and decide, with humility, to ask God for the strength to release that person. It could be a friend, a family member, or even a stranger. The first step is not to wait for the person to ask for forgiveness, but to act with generosity in our hearts and offer forgiveness without expecting anything in return. Forgiveness is not a burden, but a path to the true peace that God wants to give us. It liberates and transforms us because it is in forgiveness that we experience inner renewal. Faith is the foundation of everything. It's not just believing that God exists, but fully trusting in His plan, even when we cannot see the details. In difficult moments, faith becomes our beacon, guiding us through the darkness. It gives us the strength to move forward, even when the situation seems hopeless. Living by faith is accepting that God always has the best for us, even when our human eyes cannot comprehend the situation. Faith leads us to trust in God, not just in words, but in actions. Faith strengthens us in adversity, making us realize that every challenge is an opportunity to grow. It may be that, at some point, you feel fear or doubt, but this is when faith needs to become stronger. Remember that God always acts on our behalf, even if we don't immediately see the fruits. The Lord promises us that, as we walk by faith, He will never abandon us. Our confidence is not in our own strength, but in God's power, which is infallible. As Hebrews 11 verse 1 says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Living by faith is not expecting everything to be easy, but believing that with God by our side, we can face anything. Imagine a difficult moment in your life. Now, think about how it would be if you, instead of panicking, chose to trust that God already has a plan. You could pray, asking God to increase your faith, and continue believing that He will bring victory at the right time. Faith is like a seed that, when nurtured, produces abundant fruit, allowing you to see the impossible becoming reality. Obedience to God is a reflection of our love and trust in Him. When we choose to follow His commandments, we are not just fulfilling an obligation, but showing that we believe His plan is the best for our lives. Obedience leads us along paths that we may not immediately understand, but that, over time, prove to be the safest and most peaceful. Being obedient is trusting in God more than in our own reasoning or will, knowing that He always wants what is best for us, even when the journey seems challenging. Sometimes, obedience can be difficult, especially when we don't understand the purpose behind divine instructions. But obedience carries promises of blessings. When we act with faith and obedience, we open doors to a fuller life aligned with God's purpose. A simple example of this can be choosing to help someone, even when you don't have much time or resources. When you obey the call to serve, God blesses not only the other person, but also your life in ways you may not immediately see. The Lord sees hearts willing to obey, and this attracts His grace in deep ways. Obeying doesn't just mean following the rules, but, most importantly, listening to what God tells us and acting according to His direction. This can be a daily practice, for example, deciding to prioritize prayer, even with a busy schedule. When we obey, we find a greater purpose in everything we do, and the impact of our actions can go far beyond what we imagine. Obedience teaches us to live according to divine wisdom, recognizing that God's will is the best path. And by doing so, we experience the true freedom that only comes with surrendering to His plan. Service is a practical expression of love and humility. When we choose to serve others, we reflect the heart of Christ, who came to serve, not to be served. The act of service is not limited to grand gestures, but is found in the small details of daily life. It could be as simple as helping someone with a problem, listening attentively, or sharing something we have. Service, when done with joy, brings us closer to God and teaches us to live in community, recognizing that our lives have a purpose beyond ourselves. By serving, we experience a deep sense of fulfillment and connection. The true essence of service is not in what we give, but in the attitude with which we give. It's not about the quantity or doing something grand, but doing what is within our reach with generosity and love. For example, you can offer your time to help a neighbor or dedicate a few hours to volunteer work. Even these small gestures can have a profound impact because God sees the heart behind each action. Service is a way to imitate Christ and live according to His will, recognizing that when we help others, we are helping God. Furthermore, service teaches us to be humble and grateful. It makes us realize that by giving to others, we are also receiving much more. It may be that, by serving, you discover a joy and peace that you wouldn't find otherwise. Service allows us to experience true community, where everyone has something to offer. When we serve others, we are, in fact, being served by God, because He delights in our hearts willing to do good. And it is in this cycle of generosity and love that we find the true fullness of life. Generosity is a virtue that goes far beyond giving something material. It's an attitude of the heart, reflected not only in material goods but in time, attention, and affection. When we are generous, we recognize that everything we have is a gift from God, and therefore, we desire to share it. Generosity opens doors to authentic relationships and helps us grow spiritually. By giving, we are not only helping others but also allowing God to multiply what we have. Sometimes, the simple act of listening or supporting someone can be a gesture more valuable than any material possession. Generosity is not measured by quantity, but by the willingness of the heart. A practical example of this is when you decide to help someone without expecting anything in return, whether in a time of need or simply to make someone smile. It can be as simple as offering a smile or a listening ear. Generosity transforms us because, by giving with joy, we experience a deeper connection with others and with God. And, contrary to what we often think, generosity does not leave us poorer, it fills us with spiritual wealth, because God always honors those who have an open heart. Additionally, generosity teaches us that the true value of things is not in how much we have, but in how much we are willing to share. Often, God asks us to be generous with what we have, even when there isn't much left. When we do this, we are not only reflecting His love, but also allowing Him to do a powerful work in our lives. Generosity teaches us to trust that when we give from the heart, God always provides what we need. It is through generosity that we can build a more fraternal and peaceful world. Patience is a virtue that teaches us to trust in God's perfect timing. Often, we are impatient for things to happen our way and on our time, but it is at the right moment that God has the best for us. Patience allows us to wait with confidence, knowing that everything has a purpose, even when we cannot immediately see the outcome. It helps us remain calm in adversity and be perseverant in difficulties. When we practice patience, we make room for God to prepare us for the blessings that will come in His perfect time. Being patient doesn't mean being passive or giving up, but trusting that God is working in all situations. You may be waiting for an answer to something important or anxious about a change in your life. In those moments, patience is key to not losing faith. Remember that often God tests us to strengthen our character and teach us to depend on Him. Just as a plant needs time to grow and bloom, patience helps us mature spiritually, so we can handle blessings more wisely when they arrive. Furthermore, patience helps us cultivate inner peace. When we trust in God's timing, we stop worrying so much about what hasn't happened yet and begin to live in the present. Instead of lamenting things we cannot control, we focus on what we can do today to grow in faith and gratitude. When we are patient, we realize that God's victories come at the right time, and not before. By trusting in His plan, we feel more at ease, knowing that the journey itself is as valuable as the arrival. Gratitude is an attitude that transforms our perspective on life. Often, it is easy to focus on difficulties or on the things we lack, but when we choose to be grateful, we see life in a different way. Gratitude is not limited to thanking for the obvious blessings but also recognizing what God is doing in the hardest moments. Even in adversity, we can find reasons to be thankful, knowing that He has a perfect plan. Gratitude aligns us with God's purpose, reminding us that, despite the challenges, God is always present, guiding us and strengthening us. Being grateful doesn't mean ignoring the challenges, but recognizing them in light of God's faithfulness. When we look back and see how much we have already overcome, it fills us with confidence to face the next steps. Gratitude teaches us humility, as it helps us realize that everything we have is a gift from God. As written in 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 18, "Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." When we give thanks, we are declaring our trust in God's plan, even when we do not understand all the circumstances. Gratitude also brings peace to the heart. It helps us dispel fear and anxiety, as we remember that God is taking care of us and is in control of all things. Instead of focusing on what we lack, we begin to see the blessings we already have. A practical example is, upon waking up, pausing to thank for the simple things in life, health, family, or even a new day. These small moments of gratitude prepare us to live with a lighter heart and greater joy, regardless of the situations around us. When we practice gratitude, we open space for God to continue working in our lives, filling us with His love and peace. Forgiveness is one of the most powerful pillars of our spiritual journey. Forgiving does not mean that we must ignore the offenses or forget what has been done to us, but rather release the weight of the hurt and let God take care of justice. When we forgive, we free our hearts from a burden that, if carried, prevents us from living in peace. Jesus teaches us that forgiveness is essential, as He also forgave us for our shortcomings. By doing so, we allow God's love to flow freely in our lives and, consequently, in our relationships. Forgiveness is not an easy act, but it is a choice that brings freedom, healing, and restoration. Forgiving is often more beneficial for the one who forgives than for the one being forgiven. Forgiveness dissolves hate, anger, and resentment, emotions that can corrode our peace and our relationship with God. Imagine a situation where someone deeply hurt you. Instead of carrying that burden, you choose to forgive. This doesn't mean you have to get close to the person or accept their behavior, but rather release the evil that stayed in your heart. This choice paves the way for healing and reconciliation, both with others and with God. As written in Ephesians 4 verse 32, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." Moreover, forgiveness teaches us to live with a lighter heart, full of grace. It allows us to grow not only spiritually but emotionally. When we forgive, we follow the example of Christ, who, while being crucified, prayed, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23 verse 34. Forgiveness enables us to be more human, more connected to one another, and, above all, more aligned with God's heart. Each act of forgiveness brings us closer to His holiness and gives us the strength to live in peace, regardless of the circumstances around us. Faith is the foundation upon which we build our spiritual life. Having faith does not just mean believing in God, but living according to that belief, trusting that He is always working for our good, even when we cannot see or understand. Faith is a vision beyond visible circumstances, and through it, we are able to keep our hope alive, even in times of trial. When we have faith, we know that even when the paths seem uncertain, God is in control, guiding us and strengthening us every step of the way. Faith is the certainty that God's promise is true, and He never fails to fulfill what He has promised. Faith teaches us to act according to what we believe, without being swayed by the insecurities of the moment. Sometimes, life can be challenging, and discouragement may strike us, but it is in these moments that faith becomes most powerful. Jesus teaches us that, with faith, we can move mountains. This does not mean that difficulties will disappear, but that, with faith, we will find the strength to face them with courage. For example, you may be facing an illness or a loss, and instead of giving in to fear, you choose to trust that God is working in your life, bringing restoration and healing in His time. Faith is what gives us the confidence to move forward, even when the future seems uncertain. Additionally, faith brings us closer to God because when we trust in Him, our life begins to reflect His will. It gives us a clearer vision of the purpose He has for us, helping us make decisions aligned with His plans. Faith propels us to live more courageously, act with more certainty, and seek what is good, just, and true. With each act of faith, our relationship with God deepens, and His promises become more real in our lives. Faith is the key that opens doors to a deeper relationship with God and a life full of hope, for we know that He is always with us, guiding us every step of the way. Obedience is an expression of complete trust in God and His plan for our lives. Often, obeying is not easy, especially when what He asks of us challenges our desires or expectations. However, obedience leads us to a fuller life, aligned with God's divine purpose. When we obey, we show that we trust God's wisdom more than our own understanding. He knows what is best for us, even if we cannot see it right away. Obedience, therefore, is a demonstration of faith because when we obey, we are saying, I trust that what God has for me is better than any plan I could make. Obedience is also a reflection of our love for God. In John 14 verse 15, Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." This reminds us that obeying God should not be seen as a burden, but as an opportunity to express our devotion and gratitude. Each step of obedience we take brings us closer to God and allows us to experience His peace and wisdom. It may be that, at times, obedience requires us to set aside our own desires or make difficult decisions. But it is precisely in those moments that obedience becomes an act of faith and trust. By obeying, God leads us along a path of transformation and prepares us for the blessings He has for us. Obedience allows us to live a more meaningful life because it directs us toward the good works God has prepared for us. Ephesians 2 verse 10. When we follow His commandments, we are not just striving to live rightly, but we are also becoming instruments of His will on earth. Obedience is not something we should do merely out of obligation, but out of an understanding of what God desires for us. Every act of obedience is a step toward true freedom, because by following God's way, we find a peace that the world cannot offer. And, in the end, we see that His approval gives us a joy and fulfillment that nothing else can provide.